World War I was optimistically dubbed the war to end all wars, yet its impact has echoed across the decades in ways no one at the time imagined. More than a century later, we still live in the shadow of the Great War. From ongoing conflicts rooted in its aftermath to cultural and political revolutions it set in motion. This video will take you on a journey through World War I's chronological story, while exploring the political implications, social impact, and cultural legacy of this tragic conflict. How did a war that people hoped would end all wars instead sow the seeds of future turmoil? And what lessons does its legacy hold for us today? Let's dive into history and find out. The road to war. Tensions rise in Europe. Before the shots were fired and the trenches dug, Europe in the early 20th century was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Several great powers were locked in a fierce competition for military might and colonial influence. Nations formed tangled alliances, dividing Europe into rival camps. On one side were the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and on the other, the Allied Powers, led by Britain, France, and Russia. A sense of nationalism was surging. People took immense pride in their countries and empires, sometimes to the point of viewing others as threats. This nationalism, combined with an arms race, especially between Britain and Germany at sea, created a highly combustible environment. In the Balkans, often called the powder keg of Europe, tensions were especially high. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled over diverse ethnic groups, many of whom yearned for independence or unification with their ethnic kin in neighboring countries. Meanwhile, Serbia, with Russian backing, hoped to unite Slavic peoples under its leadership. All it would take was one crisis to ignite this volatile situation, and in the summer of 1914, that crisis came. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. This assassination was the spark that lit the fuse. Austria-Hungary, eager to punish Serbia, whom it blamed for supporting the assassins, issued an ultimatum that led to war. Because of the interlocking alliances, what could have been a local conflict quickly spiraled out of control. In early August 1914, one nation after another declared war, pulling the great powers into a cataclysm. Enthusiasm was high in many capitals. Cheering crowds in Vienna, Berlin, Paris, and London sent their armies off, convinced the war would be over by Christmas. Little did they know that they were embarking on one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. 1914, outbreak of the Great War. With war declared in August 1914, Germany faced a two-front war against France in the west and Russia in the east. The German leadership, hoping to knock out France quickly, executed the Schlieffen Plan, a massive sweep through neutral Belgium to strike France by surprise. This invasion of Belgium brought Great Britain into the war. Britain had pledged to defend Belgian neutrality. German armies came within sight of Paris, but in September the French and British rallied at the First Battle of the Marne, halting the German advance. The initial hopes of a short, glorious war faded as both sides dug in. By late 1914, the Western Front, running through Belgium and northern France, solidified into a line of entrenched armies. What had been a war of movement now stalled into stalemate. Soldiers on both sides carved deep trenches in the earth, sheltering from the deadly new weapons that industrial technology had brought to the battlefield. Machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, and modern rifles made frontal attacks devastatingly costly. Any open ground between the trenches became a no-man's land, a killing zone littered with barbed wire and shell craters. As autumn turned to winter, both sides realized that this war was not going to end quickly. Yet, even amidst the early carnage, there were glimmers of humanity. In December 1914, along parts of the front, the guns fell silent for Christmas. In an astounding spontaneous truce, British and German soldiers climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, sang carols, exchanged small gifts like cigarettes, and even famously kicked around a few footballs, soccer balls. This Christmas truce of 1914 was a brief moment of fellowship and peace in an otherwise relentless war. But it was not to last. High commands on both sides soon put a stop to such truces, and the soldiers returned to their trenches to resume the fighting. Stalemate and suffering. Trench warfare, 1915 to 1916. With both sides unable to achieve a quick victory, World War I settled into a grueling war of attrition. In 1915 and 1916, the Western Front was defined by trench warfare, a static, miserable form of combat that tested the endurance of all involved. Soldiers lived for months in muddy, rat-infested trenches. They endured cold, rain, and the constant threat of enemy fire. Daily life was a mix of boredom and terror, long periods of routine interrupted by intense artillery bombardments or orders to go over the top, to climb out of the trench and charge the enemy. New weapons only made the slaughter worse. In April 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the German army introduced a horrifying new weapon: poison gas. Chlorine gas crept over Allied trenches in a sickly yellow-green cloud, searing lungs and causing panic. A British observer described the scene with vivid horror. "I could hardly believe my eyes. The bank was absolutely covered with bodies of gassed men. Must have been over 1,000 of them." Poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, and the dreaded mustard gas inflicted agonizing injuries, blinding, burning skin and lungs, and became one of the most feared aspects of the war. Soldiers quickly improvised gas masks. At first, simply cloth soaked in water or urine, later effective respirators. But gas remained a constant threat. Major offensives in this period resulted in staggering casualties for minimal gains. In 1916, the Allies and Central Powers launched two of history's bloodiest battles. The Battle of Verdun, February to December 1916, was Germany's attempt to bleed France dry by attacking a position of symbolic importance. Verdun became a hellish meat grinder. French and German troops fought for months over a few miles of shell-blasted ground. Meanwhile, the British launched the Battle of the Somme in July 1916 to relieve pressure on Verdun. On the very first day of the Somme offensive, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead, the bloodiest single day in British military history. To put that in perspective, one day at the Somme saw over 11 times more British casualties than the Allies suffered on D-Day in World War II. Scenes from the Somme and Verdun were nightmarish. Endlessly bombarded landscapes with no trees or buildings left standing, just mud, craters, and shattered corpses. By the end of those battles, each had produced well over 1 million casualties combined, for territorial gains that could be measured in yards. For the soldiers, life in the trenches was a test of endurance and sanity. They contended with trench foot from standing in waterlogged trenches, a painful rotting of the feet, rampant lice infestations, and giant rats feeding on the dead. The constant shell fire produced a psychological trauma then known as shell shock, what we'd recognize today as PTSD. Many young men who had eagerly volunteered in 1914 now became deeply disillusioned. The glory and honor they'd been promised turned out to be mud, blood, and grief. This sense of betrayal and loss would later be captured in poems and memoirs by soldiers, like English poet Wilfred Owen, who bitterly wrote of the old lie that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country after witnessing the gruesome death of comrades in a gas attack. War beyond the Western Front. While trench warfare ravaged France and Belgium, World War I was truly a global conflict. Fighting raged on multiple fronts. Eastern Front. On the plains of Eastern Europe, battles between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia were more fluid than in the West, but just as deadly. Early in the war, Russia suffered a disastrous defeat at Tannenberg, 1914, against Germany, and the front seesawed across modern-day Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics. By 1915, German and Austro-Hungarian forces had driven deep into Russian territory. Millions of soldiers clashed in battles like Gorlitz-Tarnów and Brusilov's Offensive, 1916. Unlike the trench deadlock in France, the Eastern Front saw sweeping movements, but the vast distances and poor infrastructure meant soldiers there faced long marches, harsh winters, and equally appalling casualties. Civilians in the East also suffered terribly from food shortages and the violence of occupation. Southern fronts. Austria-Hungary also fought Italy in the Alpine Mountains after Italy joined the Allies in 1915. The Italian front saw brutal high-altitude trench warfare in the Alps, including 12 battles along the Isonzo River. Further south, on the Balkan front, the Allies and Central Powers battled in places like Serbia and later Greece. In 1915, the Allies attempted a bold strategy to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by force, the Gallipoli Campaign. British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, hoping to seize the strategic Dardanelles Strait. However, the Ottoman Turks, led in part by a determined officer named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, fiercely repelled them. After months of harsh fighting on the cliffs and beaches and heavy losses, the Allies evacuated Gallipoli in early 1916. It was a costly failure, but it later became a defining national legend for Australia and New Zealand, Anzacs, for their soldiers' bravery. Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, entering the war on Germany's side, faced its own multi-front struggle. In the Middle East, British forces, with many Indian troops, fought the Ottomans in sprawling deserts and ancient cities. There was fighting in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, where the British captured Baghdad, and in Palestine, where Allied troops took Jerusalem and Damascus. A famous chapter of this front was the Arab Revolt. Arab leaders, encouraged by British liaison T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, rose against Ottoman rule. They hoped to form independent Arab states after the war. Arabic guerrilla fighters, alongside Lawrence, harassed Ottoman supply lines with guerrilla tactics. The collapse of Ottoman control in these regions laid the groundwork for the modern Middle East's borders. More on that legacy soon. Africa and Asia. European colonial rivalries meant that fighting even spread to Africa, as Allied forces attacked German colonies, in places like today's Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, and Togo. These campaigns were smaller in scale but drew in thousands of African soldiers and porters, and the local populations felt the war's strain. In Asia, Japan joined the Allies in 1914 and seized German-held territories in China and the Pacific. From the jungles of East Africa to the waters of the Pacific, World War I truly spanned the globe. War at sea. Control of the seas was crucial. The powerful British Royal Navy blockaded Germany, cutting off supplies and starving its economy. In response, Germany deployed U-boats, submarines, to sink ships supplying Britain. This unrestricted submarine warfare led to infamous incidents like the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915 by a U-boat, killing almost 1,200 people, including Americans. Naval warfare culminated in 1916's Battle of Jutland, the only full-scale clash of battleships between Britain and Germany. Jutland was tactically indecisive. Both sides claimed victory, but it reinforced British naval dominance. The German High Seas Fleet never again seriously challenged the Royal Navy in the open sea after 1916. Under the waves, however, the U-boat threat would continue to haunt the Allies. In all these theaters, millions of people from around the world were drawn into the conflict, not just Europeans. Soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and other lands served and sacrificed. World War I was the first war that could truly be called worldwide, and its outcome would reshape continents. 1917. The tide turns, revolution and intervention. By 1917, the strain of war was taking its toll on all belligerents. After nearly 3 years of carnage with no clear victor, two pivotal events in 1917 changed the course of the war. First, the Russian Revolution. In the East, Russia reached a breaking point. The war had exacerbated economic hardship and public discontent in Russia. In March 1917, mass protests and soldier mutinies in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. A provisional government continued the war for a few months, but the Russian army was collapsing. Soldiers were war-weary, and peasants wanted land reform. In November 1917, October by the old Russian calendar, Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in Russia with promises of peace, land, and bread. True to their word, the new Bolshevik government sought an exit from the war. In early 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, ending Russia's involvement. This was a massive victory for Germany on paper. Russia surrendered huge swathes of territory, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Although Germany could now shift troops west, the harsh terms of Brest-Litovsk sowed instability, and the absence of an eastern front would be short-lived because of the second event. Second, the United States enters the war. Across the Atlantic, the United States had remained neutral since 1914, though it traded heavily with the Allies. German unrestricted submarine warfare, however, increasingly angered Americans as U-boats sank civilian ships. In early 1917, Germany gambled on all-out submarine warfare to starve Britain, knowing it might provoke the U.S. They even attempted to ally with Mexico against the U.S., as revealed by the Zimmermann telegram that Britain intercepted. These German moves were the final straw. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and declared that the world must be made safe for democracy, asking for a declaration of war on Germany. The United States formally entered World War I on the Allied side. For the war-weary Allies, America's entry was a huge morale boost. Fresh American troops, doughboys, and abundant supplies began arriving in France in mid-1917. Although it took time to train and deploy U.S. forces in large numbers, their presence foreshadowed an Allied advantage. Meanwhile, on the home front, American industry and agriculture ramped up to support the war, providing critical food, munitions, and finances to the exhausted Allies. Political scientist Peter Feaver notes that the U.S. being thrust into a global leadership role in World War I was an unexpected but pivotal moment, a harbinger of its later role as a world power. Indeed, by tipping the balance, America's involvement would help end the stalemate. Technological and tactical shifts in 1917. This year also saw the introduction of new tactics and weapons that hinted at ways to break the deadlock. In April 1917, the British launched the Battle of Vimy Ridge with a significant Canadian force, and later Passchendaele, Third Ypres, in the summer, grinding battles that still cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But late in 1917, at Cambrai, the British used a large number of tanks in coordination with infantry and artillery, achieving a surprise breakthrough, though eventually lost ground in a German counterattack. The tank, a new invention, proved that the days of trench stalemate were numbered. Airplanes, too, had evolved from flimsy scouts to fighters and bombers. By 1917, the sky was filled with duels between flying aces and the first strategic bombing raids on cities. War in the air was born, and although its impact in WWI was limited, it was a sign of changes to come. 1917 was a dark year for Allied morale, until the Americans truly began to arrive in force in 1918. The Allied cause had nearly cracked. The French army even suffered widespread mutinies in 1917 after horrific losses, though they regrouped under new leadership. But with Russia out and America in, everyone sensed 1918 would be decisive. 1918, the end of the Great War. Germany's leaders understood that their best chance to win was before American manpower could fully tip the scales. In the spring of 1918, with troops freed from the Eastern Front, Germany launched a massive series of offensives on the Western Front, known as the Spring Offensive. The German armies struck with new tactics, stormtrooper infiltration units that bypassed strong points, and initially made significant gains, tearing great gaps in the Allied lines. Paris was shelled by long-range guns, and it looked like Germany might finally achieve the breakthrough victory that had eluded them for years. But these last offensives were a final desperate gamble. The Germans advanced farther than they had since 1914, yet they overstretched their supply lines and suffered irreplaceable casualties. The Allied armies, now under a coordinated command, French General Ferdinand Foch as supreme commander, absorbed the blows and held on. As summer 1918 arrived, fresh American divisions were now pouring into France at a rate of 10,000 soldiers per day. In battles such as Cantigny, Château-Thierry, and Belleau Wood, U.S. troops saw significant combat, helping to blunt the German offensive. In August 1918, the Allies launched a massive counteroffensive often called the 100 Days Offensive, combining British, French, American, and other Allied forces with improved tactics, including tanks and aircraft in support. The results were dramatic. One by one, the German positions that had held for so long were overwhelmed. In the Battle of Amiens, August 1918, Allied troops achieved a significant breakthrough. The German High Command started referring to that day as the Black Day of their army. With tanks rolling through barbed wire and squadrons of aircraft roaming overhead, the trench warfare stalemate was being decisively broken. By September and October, the Germans were in full retreat across a broad front. Their allies were collapsing too. Bulgaria surrendered in late September. The Ottoman Empire capitulated in October after British-led forces captured Damascus and beyond. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, teetering from internal ethnic strains and military defeats, the Italians won a decisive victory at Vittorio Veneto in October, also sued for peace by early November. Starved by blockade, exhausted by 4 years of total war, Germany was left isolated and facing inevitable defeat. German morale at home and on the front was at a breaking point. Sailors mutinied at Kiel rather than sail on a suicide mission, and unrest spread in German cities. On November 9, 1918, the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, abdicated as revolution broke out in Germany. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. Germany signed an armistice agreement with the Allies in a railcar in Compiègne, France, ending the fighting of World War I. After 4 years of unprecedented bloodshed, the Great War was finally over. The sense of relief was enormous. In Allied nations, crowds cheered and church bells rang out on that first Armistice Day. Yet the war ended not with a clear-cut victory parade into enemy capitals, but with weary negotiations and an exhausted enemy laying down arms. German armies were still on foreign soil when they stopped fighting, which later fed a false narrative that Germany hadn't truly been beaten in the field, the so-called stab-in-the-back myth. But make no mistake, Germany and its allies were beaten. They simply had no capacity left to continue the struggle against the rejuvenated Allies. The human cost of World War I was almost beyond comprehension. By its end, an entire generation had been decimated. More than 9.7 million soldiers from over 24 nations lay dead, joined by about 6.8 million civilian deaths caused by war, famine, and disease. Roughly 16.5 million people in total perished. Millions more were wounded, many maimed for life, and an entire cohort of young men was traumatized. The war that was supposed to be quick and glorious had become an industrial-scale slaughter. Political aftermath: a shattered world order. The end of the fighting in 1918 was just the beginning of a complex and contentious peace process. The old world order, monarchies and empires that had ruled for centuries, lay in ruins. There had been 5 mighty European empires at the war's start: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman, and British empires. By the war's end, only one, the British, remained with its monarchy intact. The others had crumbled. Germany became a republic, the Kaiser gone, a new government formed in Weimar. Austria-Hungary disintegrated entirely. Its various ethnic peoples, Czechs, Slovaks, South Slavs, Hungarians, Ukrainians, and more, declared independence or joined new nations. Russia was in the throes of revolution and civil war. The once vast Russian Empire had splintered, with places like Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states breaking away, at least temporarily. Ottoman Empire collapsed, losing its Arab territories to British and French control. In Anatolia, a Turkish nationalist movement would soon abolish the Sultanate and form modern Turkey. In 1919, the victorious Allies convened in Paris to hammer out peace treaties that would formally end the war and set the terms for the post-war world. The most significant was the Treaty of Versailles, imposed on Germany. The Treaty of Versailles is signed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, June 28, 1919, formally ending the state of war between Germany and the Allies. The treaty terms were harsh. Germany was forced to accept sole blame for the war, the infamous war guilt clause, relinquish territory, such as Alsace-Lorraine to France, parts of Prussia to the new Poland, etc., cede all its overseas colonies, limit its military to a fraction of its former strength, and pay huge reparations, financial compensation, to the Allies. At the time, these terms were celebrated by Allied publics eager to punish Germany, but some voices, like British economist John Maynard Keynes, warned that an overly harsh peace could breed resentment and instability. Indeed, the punitive nature of the Treaty of Versailles would become a source of deep grievance in Germany, fueling extremist sentiments in the years to come. Elsewhere, new nations were being carved from the wreckage of empires. President Woodrow Wilson had gone to Paris advocating the principle of self-determination, the idea that ethnic peoples should have their own nations where possible. This ideal was applied imperfectly. Europe saw the birth or resurrection of countries like Poland, reappearing on the map after over a century, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, a South Slavic kingdom, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and others. Each of these new states had minorities within their borders, leading to future tensions, but they represented a dramatic redrawing of the map. In the Middle East, however, self-determination was largely ignored in favor of colonial interests. France and Britain had secretly agreed in the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide the Ottoman Arab lands. As a result, European powers drew arbitrary boundaries across the Middle East, creating new entities like Iraq, Transjordan, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon under European administration, British or French mandates. These borders often had little regard for the region's ethnic or religious realities, planting seeds of conflict that still persist. For instance, Britain promised the same land, Palestine, to both Arab allies and to the Jewish people via the 1917 Balfour Declaration, setting the stage for the Arab-Israeli conflict. As Professor Erdal Göknar observes, World War I established the modern Middle East as we know it, with European colonial fingerprints all over the new states, creating a legacy of tension and strife. The peace conference also created the League of Nations, an international organization envisioned by Woodrow Wilson to prevent future wars through collective security and diplomacy. It was a noble idea, a forerunner to today's United Nations, but the League had critical weaknesses. Ironically, the United States itself never joined the League. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles due to political opposition. Thus, the U.S. turned inward to isolationism in the 1920s. Without the US, and with Germany and Soviet Russia initially excluded, the League lacked the clout to enforce its will. In the 1930s, it would fail to stop aggression by new expansionist powers. Nonetheless, the creation of the League showed that World War I had at least instilled a desire to avoid another catastrophic war, even if that desire alone proved insufficient. In summary, politically, the world after WWI was almost unrecognizable compared to 1914. Ancient monarchies were gone, replaced by fledgling democracies or unstable regimes. A whole new international order was attempted at Paris, but it was a fragile one. The harsh peace treaty, especially toward Germany, would have dire consequences. Many historians later argued that the seeds of World War II were planted at Versailles. The treaty's punitive terms and the unresolved grievances left many nations, not just Germany, but also Italy, Japan, and others, dissatisfied. The hope that World War I would be the last war, tragically, would be proven wrong just 2 decades later. Social upheaval and impact on society. Beyond maps and treaties, World War I profoundly changed societies in ways that would be felt for generations. The social impact of the war was immense, a lost generation. With so many millions dead or disabled, almost every community in Europe was touched by tragedy. In Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere, an entire generation of young men had been nearly wiped out. The war was often commemorated by monument lists of names, long rolls of sons, brothers, fathers who never came home. For those who did survive, many carried physical and psychological scars. The term lost generation came to describe not only the dead, but also the disillusioned survivors. The pre-war world of 1914, with its certainties and optimism, felt like a bygone era. In its place was a society grappling with grief and shock. Countless veterans struggled to reintegrate. Some, dealing with shell shock, PTSD, found little support in societies that didn't fully understand their trauma. Women's roles and rights. World War I also acted as a great social leveler and a catalyst for change in gender roles. With millions of men at the front, women stepped into roles that were previously denied to them. They worked in munitions factories, nicknamed munitionettes in Britain, drove ambulances, served as nurses near the front lines, and kept farms and businesses running at home. In Russia, women even formed a combat battalion. This massive contribution significantly shifted perceptions about women's capabilities. The war, in effect, advanced the cause of women's suffrage. Countries began granting women the right to vote, partly as recognition of their wartime service. Canada did so in 1917, Britain, Germany, and Poland in 1918, Austria and the Netherlands in 1919. The United States passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, ratified in 1920, shortly after the war. As one historian put it, World War I broke down most of the remaining opposition to women's suffrage. Beyond voting rights, women's participation in the workforce during the war laid the groundwork for changing social norms about women working outside the home, though many women were pushed out of their factory jobs when the men returned. Still, the image of the capable, patriotic woman worker or nurse became part of the national narratives. Class and social equality. The war also blurred class distinctions. In the trenches, a nobleman and a laborer shared the same mud and danger. This did not erase class differences overnight, but it did undermine some of the old, rigid social hierarchies. After the war, there was less deference to aristocracy. Many aristocratic families had lost heirs and fortunes. Meanwhile, socialist ideas gained popularity in parts of Europe, fueled by the shared sacrifice of the working classes and the example of the Russian Revolution. Some soldiers returned home expecting a better life as a reward for their service. Homes fit for heroes, as promised in Britain, which led to some early welfare policies and housing programs. In Germany and Italy, economic turmoil and anger at the unmet promises of a better world contributed to social unrest, and, eventually, to the rise of extremist movements, the Nazis in Germany and fascists in Italy, though that develops in the 1920s and 30s. Civil rights and race relations. The war's social impact was global. In the United States, for example, the draft and the military brought together people from all walks of life, including African American soldiers who served in segregated units. About 200,000 African Americans were sent to Europe with the American Expeditionary Forces, where some of them, like the Harlem Hellfighters, fought with distinction alongside French forces. For many black soldiers, service in Europe was an eye-opening experience. They encountered societies with less overt racism than Jim Crow America, and they were treated as heroes by the French. One African American sergeant on returning said, "I now have the world's experience." These soldiers came back to the United States with new determination to fight for their own rights. Indeed, World War I was a catalyst for the early civil rights movement. Activists like W.E.B. Du Bois pressed the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home. Unfortunately, the immediate post-war period in 1919 saw a backlash. That year became known as the Red Summer, for numerous race riots in American cities, and at least 11 African American veterans were lynched still wearing their uniforms. The clash between the promise of freedom and the reality of racism led to increased activism. Many leaders of the subsequent civil rights struggles were from the generation that came of age during or just after World War II, War I. The war had exposed deep contradictions and spurred a fight that would continue for decades. Economic and health impacts. The war also had more immediate social effects. Economically, it devastated the European economies. Cities and infrastructure were destroyed in war zones, and the cost of fighting left nations deep in debt. Europe's dominance of the global economy was shaken. The United States emerged as a leading creditor nation. In the colonies of European powers, the war effort had extracted resources and promised reforms. For instance, thousands of Indians fought for Britain, and this bolstered the Indian independence movement when reforms were slow to come after the war. In Ireland, resentment over wartime conditions fueled the drive for independence, leading to the Irish War of Independence shortly after World War I. And as if the war zone toll wasn't enough, in 1918 to 1918, a deadly influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu, swept the globe, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide, far more than the war itself. The movement of troops and the chaos of war had helped incubate and spread this pandemic. It struck soldiers and civilians alike, adding to the sense that the world had been through an apocalyptic trial by the time it finally subsided. In sum, World War I acted as a great accelerator of social change. It upended traditional norms, advanced some causes, like women's suffrage and labor rights, while also exposing society's injustices, like racial inequality, in stark ways. The world that emerged in the 1920s was one where people were more cynical about authority and old promises. The younger generation, having seen the failure of old ideals on the battlefields, often embraced new attitudes that were freer, more skeptical, or even rebellious, setting the stage for the Roaring Twenties culturally. Cultural legacy, transforming art, literature, and memory. The cultural shockwaves of World War I were profound. The war had shaken faith in the old world's order and values, and this upheaval was reflected in art, literature, and collective memory. The legacy of World War I in culture can be seen in several ways: literature and poetry. The immediate years after the war produced a rich body of literature from those who experienced the trenches. War poets like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Rupert Brooke in Britain, and novelists like Erich Maria Remarque in Germany, shared with the world the grim reality and futility they had witnessed. Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, 1929, became internationally acclaimed for its raw portrayal of a German soldier's suffering, resonating far beyond Germany's borders as a universal anti-war statement. In Britain, poets who had once written patriotic verse early in the war turned to searing honesty about the trauma and waste of life. Owen's poem, Dulce et decorum est, for example, graphically describes a gas attack and calls the idea of dying gloriously for one's country the old lie. This was a far cry from the romanticized war stories of earlier generations. The war also influenced American writers. Many of the Lost Generation authors, like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, were shaped by the war's after effects and disillusionment. Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, 1929, drew on his experiences on the Italian front to depict the senselessness of war and the search for meaning in its wake. Art and movements. In the art world, World War I shattered classical traditions and gave rise to modernist movements. Artists struggled to represent the indescribable horror of what they had seen. Some decided that traditional realistic art could no longer capture the truth of a world gone mad. The result was an explosion of new art forms in the 1920s. Dadaism, for instance, emerged during the war, starting in neutral Switzerland. It was an anti-art movement that embraced nonsense and absurdity. Essentially, a protest against the rational world that had led to such irrational destruction. Dada artists like Hugo Ball and Tristan Tzara used satire and chaos in their work, reflecting a deep cynicism about societal values. Surrealism followed in the post-war decade, led by artists like Salvador Dalí and André Breton. Surrealists delved into the subconscious and dreams, partially as a response to the feeling that reality itself had become nightmarish. They dissembled reality and questioned the nature of reason, which is no surprise in a post-war context where reason had failed to prevent catastrophe. In visual arts, painters like Piet Mondrian moved towards pure abstraction, turning even something as quaint as Dutch windmills into precise geometric compositions. Others, like Otto Dix and George Gross in Germany, directly depicted the war's gruesome aftermath or satirized the post-war society, often with a bitter edge. Dix's sketches of disfigured veterans and war ruins confronted people with what the newspapers often did not show. Cubism and Expressionism had begun before the war, but they took on new intensity after it. Even classical music was transformed. Composers like Igor Stravinsky had already been breaking the rules, but post-war, you have people like Arnold Schoenberg abandoning traditional harmony altogether. His atonal and 12-tone music, which paralleled a world that felt off-kilter and in need of new structures. In literature, modernist writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf also experimented with form and language in the 1920s, reflecting a fractured post-war consciousness. As the Duke University Reflection noted, the decade after WWI saw classical traditions challenged in art, literature, theater, music, and even physics, an astonishing array of human endeavor. Indeed, even science was not untouched. The war era and the 1920s saw revolutionary scientific ideas, like Einstein's relativity and new quantum physics, that upended old certainties, a fitting parallel to the way the war upended old social and cultural certainties. Commemoration and memory. Culturally, one of the biggest impacts of World War I is how societies remembered and honored the fallen. The scale of death was so immense that nations developed new rituals of remembrance. The very concept of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier originated after World War I. France and Britain buried unknown warriors in their capitals in 1920, the U.S. in 1921, symbolizing all those who were lost without identification. War memorials sprung up in virtually every town across Europe and the broader Commonwealth. These were often simple cenotaphs or statues listing the names of local sons who never returned. a stark reminder that behind the massive statistics were individual human lives and stories. One enduring symbol that emerged from the war's carnage was the red poppy. On the former battlefields of Flanders and Belgium, poppies grew over the graves and churned soil. Canadian Dr. John McCrae's 1915 poem, In Flanders Fields, famously notes, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row." The red poppy came to symbolize the blood of sacrificed soldiers and the hope of rebirth. To this day, wearing a poppy on the anniversary of the Armistice, November 11th, or on Memorial Day, is a way to honor those who died in World War I and subsequent conflicts. Remembrance Day, or Veterans Day in the U.S., on November 11th each year, is a direct legacy of World War I, a cultural practice of collective mourning and reflection that started in the early 1920s and continues a century later, with moments of silence observed at the 11th hour. Changing attitudes. Perhaps the most subtle, yet profound cultural legacy of World War I was how it changed people's outlook on war and society. The prevailing attitude after the war was, "Never again." Pacifist movements gained strength in the 1920s and 30s. Many people could not imagine ever supporting another war after the nightmare they had endured. War was no longer seen as a noble, romantic venture, as many had seen it in 1914. It was seen as a last resort, something to be avoided at nearly all costs. Unfortunately, this widespread aversion to war also meant that when aggressive totalitarian regimes arose later, democracies were hesitant to confront them early, which is one factor that led into World War II. But it's telling that even after World War II, the nations sought to create institutions, like the United Nations, much as the League had been an attempt, and frameworks, like the European Coal and Steel Community that evolved into the European Union, specifically to bind countries together and make large-scale war less likely. Those later efforts were in many ways informed directly by the cultural memory of World War I's devastation. Additionally, the war influenced popular culture and collective psychology. The 1920s saw a kind of cultural rebellion, the flapper era, jazz music spreading from the US to Europe, jazz which swept through the US, and Europe in the 1920s represented a break from old forms in music similar to what was happening in art, and a general questioning of old moral strictures. It's as if society, traumatized by war, swung in the opposite direction, embracing novelty, pleasure, and modernity, as seen in the Roaring Twenties. Yet underneath the exuberance was a sense of loss and disillusionment that colored the art and literature of the time. In summary, World War I's cultural legacy was a blend of mourning and innovation. The war produced a determination to remember the fallen and to ensure their sacrifice was not forgotten through memorials, art, poetry, and annual remembrances. At the same time, it shattered old cultural orders and unleashed a wave of creativity and new thought that still influences us today, from modern art to literature to our very understanding of war. The Great War taught humanity to question glorified narratives and to confront the real human cost of conflict. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of how a combination of pride, fear, entangled alliances, and miscalculations can spiral into catastrophe. The legacy of the Great War is tragic, yes, in the millions of lives lost and shattered, but it is also profoundly instructive. This war changed the world. It redrew borders, toppled empires, and set the stage, for better or worse, for the rest of the 20th century. It showed humanity the extreme dangers of modern industrial warfare, and it ignited social revolutions that eventually led to greater rights for many. Culturally, it left us richer in art and literature, though those works were often born from pain. Perhaps the greatest lesson World War I leaves us is to cherish peace and beware the pitfalls that lead nations into war. The phrase, "never again," became a common refrain after 1918. And while sadly, never again did not hold, a Second World War erupted just 2 decades later. The memory of World War I has continually influenced global efforts to avoid such all-consuming conflict. Even today, the echoes of the Great War's treaties, promises, and mistakes are felt in conflict zones and diplomatic relations around the globe. As we reflect on World War I's tragic legacy, we honor the sacrifices of those who lived through it and those who died. Each year on November 11th, people around the world pause to remember the Armistice and the price paid for our present day. Fields of red poppies remind us of the blood spilled and the hope that from such sacrifice a better world might grow. It is up to us to keep alive the memory and the lessons of that war, to strive for a world where diplomacy triumphs over violence, where the ideals of justice and peace guide us more than rivalries and fear. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining us in this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. Understanding World War I is crucial to understanding the world we live in now, its politics, its social dynamics, and its art and culture. We hope this deep dive has been enlightening and thought-provoking. Finally, if you enjoyed this video and want to explore more historical stories and their impact, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more content, and feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. How do you think World War I changed the world? What lessons resonate with you the most? We'd love to hear your perspective. Let's keep the conversation going. And until next time, remember the past. Cherish the peace we have now, and take care. Thank you for watching.